If you'd told me a year ago that my marriage would come crashing down because of my son's third-grade teacher, I would have laughed. But life has a way of surprising you, and not in the ways you hope for. I'm Mark Harris, 38, living in Charlotte, North Carolina. I work in IT, the kind of job that's stable, predictable, like I thought my marriage was. I've been married to Rachel for 10 years. We met at a friend's party in our 20s, bonded over bad karaoke, and somewhere between midnight conversations and lazy Sunday mornings, I fell hard. We had a son, Lucas, who's 8 now, the center of our world. Or so I thought. For the longest time, things felt normal. Routine, maybe, but comfortable. We'd wake up, rush through breakfast, drop Lucas at school, go to work, come home, eat dinner, watch a show, repeat. But somewhere along the line, that routine started to crack, and I didn't notice it until it was too late. It started with little things. Rachel became distant, not in an obvious, dramatic way, but in those subtle moments where you expect warmth and get indifference instead. She'd be glued to her phone more than usual, claiming it was work or some group chat with her friends. She started dressing up more, even when she said she was just running errands or picking Lucas up from school. I brushed it off. We'd been together for a decade, things ebb and flow. I figured we were just in one of those rough patches couples go through, but then the excuses started piling up. She'd get home late, saying she stayed behind to talk to Lucas's teacher about his progress. At first, I thought it was sweet, her being so involved. But then it became every other day. And the weirdest part? She never wanted me to come to parent-teacher meetings anymore. "You've been so busy with work," she'd say. "I've got it covered." I didn't think much of it at first. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? But trust can only blind you for so long. The first real crack in the facade came one random Wednesday evening. I remember it clearly because nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least, not at first. Rachel said she was heading to school to discuss Lucas's upcoming science project with his teacher, Mr. Carter. I didn't question it. Why would I? Lucas had been struggling a bit in science, and Rachel was always the more hands-on parent when it came to school stuff, but she didn't come back when she said she would. It was supposed to be a quick meeting. 30 minutes, maybe an hour. But when 2 hours passed and I hadn't heard from her, I started to get that feeling, the one where your gut tightens and your brain starts running wild with all the possibilities. I called her. No answer. I texted. "Everything okay?" No reply. By the time 3 hours had passed, I was pacing the living room, my mind jumping between worry and suspicion. I told myself she probably just lost track of time. Maybe her phone died. But something felt off. Then, around 10 p.m., she finally walked through the door. She was flushed, her hair slightly messy, like she'd been caught in the wind, or something else. She didn't look surprised to see me still awake, just gave me this tired smile. "Sorry, the meeting ran long," she said casually, dropping her bag by the door. Mr. Carter had a lot to say about Lucas's project. Her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for it on the way home. But I didn't push. I wanted to believe her. The next day, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I checked her phone. She was in the shower, and her phone was charging on the nightstand. I hesitated for a second, feeling that sting of guilt. But curiosity, and fear, won. Her phone wasn't locked. It never had been. That's what made it worse. That I opened her messages and scrolled through the usual ones, friends, family, nothing suspicious. But then I saw a name that stopped me cold. Ethan Carter. Lucas's teacher. I clicked on the thread, my heart pounding in my chest. The texts weren't just about school. They were flirty, personal, intimate in a way that made my stomach turn. "Ethan, last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you." Rachel, "Me too. I hate sneaking around, but it's worth it." Ethan, "When can I see you again?" Rachel, "Soon. Mark doesn't suspect a thing." Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking, but I kept scrolling, hoping, praying, that maybe I was misreading things. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. They weren't just having an affair. They were in it, deep, emotionally and physically. I put her phone back exactly where I found it, my mind spinning. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the water running in the shower, wondering how long it had been going on. Wondering how I'd missed it. When she came out, wrapped in a towel, acting like everything was normal, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and climbed into bed, completely unaware that I knew that I didn't sleep that night. That I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head, every lie, every excuse, every time I'd brushed off my gut feeling because I trusted her. But now, I knew the truth and there was no unseeing it. The next morning felt surreal, like I was watching my life unfold from the outside. Rachel moved around the house like everything was normal, pouring coffee, packing Lucas's lunch, humming to herself like she wasn't carrying a secret that had detonated our marriage the night before. I watched her from across the kitchen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. Part of me wanted to confront her right then, to throw her phone on the table and demand an explanation. But another part of me, the calmer part, knew I needed to approach this differently. I wanted to hear her lies, to see how far she'd go before admitting the truth. After Lucas left for school, I found my moment. She was wiping down the counter, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me, so I started, my voice steady, too steady. "How was your meeting with Mr. Carter last night?" Her hand froze mid-wipe, just for a second. It was quick. If I hadn't been watching closely, I might have missed it. But I saw it. She recovered fast, turning to flash me that practiced smile. "Oh, it was fine. Just the usual stuff about Lucas's project. He thinks Lucas has potential if he puts in a bit more effort." I nodded slowly, letting her dig herself deeper. "Funny," I said, setting my mug down. "Because I was thinking of meeting him myself. You know, to get a better sense of what Lucas needs to work on." Her smile faltered, just a bit. "Oh, you don't have to do that. I've got it covered." "Of course you do," I thought. That I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Rachel, how long have you been sleeping with him?" The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Her face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right lie but couldn't find it fast enough. What?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, what are you talking about?" I didn't blink. "Don't insult me, Rachel. I saw the texts." Her face shifted then, from shock to something colder. She wasn't going to cry, wasn't going to beg. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and crossed her arms to match mine. "You went through my phone?" she snapped, her tone sharp. Defensive. Not guilty. That's what hit me hardest, not the affair itself, but how easily she flipped it, like I was the one who crossed a line. "Don't turn this on me," I shot back. "You're the one sneaking around with our son's teacher." "How long, Rachel? How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then rolled her eyes like I was overreacting. "It's not a big deal, Mark. It just happened." "Not a big deal." Those words felt like a slap. "Not a big deal?" I repeated, my voice rising now. "You've been lying to me, to Lucas. You've been sneaking out, coming home late, pretending everything's fine. And it's not a big deal?" She shrugged, like this was just some minor inconvenience. "Look, I didn't plan it. It's not like I'm in love with him. It was just different. Exciting. Something I needed." Her words stung more than I expected. Something I needed. Like I wasn't enough. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to find a trace of the woman I married. "But she wasn't there." "You've destroyed this family," I said quietly, my anger giving way to something deeper, disappointment. She scoffed, turning away. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Mark. People have affairs. It doesn't have to mean the end." But it did, for me, it did. Without another word, I grabbed my keys and walked out the door, leaving her standing there in the kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of the life we'd built together, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was losing something, that I felt like I was finally seeing things clearly, that I didn't have a destination when I walked out that door. I just drove, letting the road stretch out in front of me like it could somehow lead me away from everything I just heard. The city blurred past the windows, but all I could see in my mind was Rachel's face, that face, the one that twisted my stomach. Not with guilt, not even with regret, but with indifference. That it's funny how betrayal doesn't feel the way you'd expect. You think you'll be angry, furious, ready to lash out. But instead, it felt like this slow, suffocating heaviness. Like the air had been sucked out of the world, and all I could do was gasp for breath. That I ended up in the parking lot of some random park we used to take Lucas to when he was little. I hadn't been there in years, but the familiarity of it, the swing set we pushed him on, the bench where Rachel and I would sit and talk about our future, hit me like a punch to the chest. That I sat in the car for what felt like hours, replaying everything in my head. Every late-night meeting, every dismissive comment when I'd ask about her day, every time I'd brushed off my gut feeling because I trusted her. And that was the part that hurt the most. The trust is this fragile thing you don't realize you're giving away until it's shattered. I'd trusted Rachel with everything. My heart. My family. Our son's future. And she'd thrown it all away for what? Excitement? Something different? A fling with our son's teacher. The betrayal wasn't just between Rachel and me, it was tangled up in our whole life. What would I tell Lucas? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that the people who are supposed to protect him are the ones tearing everything apart? That question kept me up all night. Eventually, I drove to Ethan's place, my best friend since college, the guy who'd seen me through every high and low. He opened the door, took one look at my face, and knew something was wrong. Mark? What happened? He asked, his voice low. That I didn't even know how to start. How do you tell someone your wife is cheating on you with your kid's teacher? It sounded like something out of a bad soap opera. It's Rachel, I finally managed, my voice hoarse. She's been having an affair. Ethan's face shifted from confusion to shock in a heartbeat. What? With who? I let out a bitter laugh, one that tasted more like pain than humor. Mr. Carter. Lucas's teacher. Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. He just shook his head, motioned for me to come in, and handed me a beer without another word. That's what good friends do. They don't ask questions you're not ready to answer. They just show up. I told him everything, finding the texts, confronting Rachel, the way she shrugged it off like it was nothing. And Ethan just listened, nodding, his jaw tight. What are you going to do? He finally asked. I stared at the wall, feeling the weight of that question settle in my chest. I didn't know. All I knew was that the life I thought I had was gone, and I had to figure out what came next. The morning after I crashed at Ethan's, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Not physically, I barely slept, but emotionally, I was wrecked. The kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones, where even breathing feels like a chore. The betrayal wasn't just a passing storm, it was this constant, low hum in the background of my thoughts. That I stared at the ceiling, running through the same questions on a loop. What now? Do I go back home? Pretend for Lucas? Confront Rachel again? File for divorce? Every option felt like a lose-lose. Ethan walked in with 2 coffees, handing one to me without saying a word. That's the thing about him, he knew when to talk and when to let silence do the heavy lifting. You have to go back eventually, he finally said after a while. If not for her, for Lucas. And that's when the weight hit me hardest. Lucas. That I hadn't even figured out how to face Rachel again, and now I had to think about how to explain this to my 8-year-old son. How do you tell your kid his mom's been sneaking around with his teacher? How do you even begin to unpack that? But Ethan was right. I couldn't hide forever. So, later that afternoon, I got in the car and drove home, my heart pounding the entire way. Every mile felt like walking toward a fire, knowing you'd get burned but having no choice but to keep going. When I pulled into the driveway, Rachel's car was there. My stomach twisted. Was he here? Was Mr. Carter in my house? I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, forcing myself to breathe, but when I walked in, it was quiet. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, looking like she hadn't slept either. She glanced up when I walked in, but there was no relief on her face, just tension. "Hey," she said softly, like we were just two people trying to navigate a normal day. I didn't respond. I dropped my keys on the counter and stared at her, waiting for her to say something, anything, that would make sense of this mess, but she didn't. After a long, heavy silence, I broke first. "Does he know?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Does Mr. Carter know you've destroyed your family?" She flinched, but I didn't feel bad. "I wanted her to feel it, Mark," she started, but I cut her off. "No. Don't. You had plenty of chances to come clean, Rachel. You chose this." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," I snapped. "You cheated. You lied. And now you're acting like this is just some misunderstanding." She didn't argue. She just stared at the table, like she couldn't even look me in the eye. "What about Lucas?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "What do we tell him?" Her eyes filled with tears then, the first real emotion I'd seen from her since this all started. But it didn't move me. I was too far gone for that. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how to fix this." And that's when it hit me, she couldn't fix this and neither could I. "Some things are just broken beyond repair." I nodded slowly, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "I'll stay in the guest room until we figure out what's best for Lucas," I said. "But after that? We're done." She didn't argue, she knew it was over, and so did I. Sleeping in the guest room of my own house felt surreal. The walls were the same, the furniture hadn't moved, but everything felt wrong. Like the house was wearing a mask, pretending things were normal when, underneath, everything had crumbled. That first night back, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of Rachel moving around in her bedroom. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle of sheets felt like a slap in the face. I wondered if she was texting him. If she was thinking about him while I was in the next room, grappling with the fallout of her choices. The next morning was worse. Lucas bounded into the kitchen, his usual energetic self, completely unaware that the foundation of his family had cracked overnight. He hugged me like nothing was wrong, and that nearly broke me. I wanted to hold him forever, protect him from the mess his mom and I had made, or, more accurately, the mess she made. Rachel acted like nothing had changed. She made breakfast, asked Lucas about school, laughed at his jokes. It was like watching a bad actor perform in a play I didn't sign up for. But the hardest part, Lucas wanted to talk about Mr. Carter. "Dad, guess what? Mr. Carter said my science project is one of the best in class." He beamed, his little face lighting up with pride that I felt my stomach twist into knots. I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. "That's great, buddy." But inside, I was screaming. Rachel shot me a glance across the table, that glance. The one that said, "Don't ruin this for him." And as much as I wanted to yell, to tell Lucas the truth, I knew she was right. For now, after breakfast, Lucas ran off to play, leaving me alone with Rachel in the kitchen. The silence between us was suffocating. Finally, she spoke. "We need to talk about how we're going to handle this with him," she said quietly. I looked at her, my jaw clenched. "You mean how you are going to explain this to him?" "Because I didn't blow up this family, Rachel. You did." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Mark, I know I screwed up. But he's our son. We need to be a united front for his sake." I laughed bitterly. "A united front? You've got some nerve. You were sneaking around with his teacher, Rachel." "His teacher? You didn't think about Lucas then?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "I made a mistake, Mark. But I still love him. And I'm still his mother. Yeah. Well, you'd better start acting like it. I snapped that. I left the house after that, needing to breathe, needing to get away from her before I said something I couldn't take back. I drove aimlessly for a while, my mind a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Eventually, I found myself back at Ethan's place. He opened the door, took one look at me, and handed me a beer without a word. That I sat on his couch, staring at the floor. I don't know how to do this, I admitted finally. I don't know how to look at her and not see every lie. And I don't know how to protect Lucas from all of this. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. One step at a time, man. You can't control what she did. But you can control how you move forward. Focus on Lucas. The rest will figure itself out. I knew he was right, but knowing it didn't make it any easier, because the road ahead wasn't just about picking up the pieces. It was about figuring out which ones were even worth saving. The next few days passed in a haze. Living under the same roof as Rachel was like walking through a minefield. Every conversation, every glance, every shared space felt loaded with tension. We spoke only when we had to, and even then, it was like talking through gritted teeth, trying to keep the facade together for Lucas, but the cracks were showing. One evening, I was sitting in the guest room, scrolling through old photos on my phone. Family vacations, birthdays, holidays, all moments that felt like they belonged to a different life. I stared at a picture of Rachel and me from our anniversary last year, smiling over a candle at dinner. At the time, I thought we were happy. Now, I wondered if she'd already started seeing him by then. The thought made my stomach churn. A knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. Rachel peeked in, her expression hesitant. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I didn't want to, but I nodded anyway. Maybe I needed to hear what she had to say, or maybe I just wanted to see how deep the lies went. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. For a moment, she just stared at the floor, like she was trying to find the right words. "I know I can't fix this," she began, her voice soft. "But I don't want us to hate each other. For Lucas's sake." I let out a bitter laugh. "For Lucas's sake? You mean the same Lucas whose teacher you're sleeping with?" She flinched but didn't deny it. That stung more than any excuse she could have given me. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to get this far." I shook my head, disbelief bubbling up again. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Rachel, you don't just trip and fall into an affair. You made a choice. Over and over." Her eyes filled with tears, but I was too angry to care. I'd seen this before, the tears, the guilt, but none of it changed the fact that she'd blown our lives apart. "Do you love him?" I asked suddenly, the question hanging in the air like a grenade. She hesitated, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to keep the rage from boiling over. "Unbelievable," I muttered. "You're in love with our son's teacher." "I don't know what I feel," she snapped, her voice rising. "It's complicated, Mark. You've been distant for years. We've been off for a long time, and you know it." That hit me harder than I expected. Part of me wanted to argue, to tell her she was deflecting, but deep down, I knew there was some truth in it. We had drifted apart. But I hadn't cheated. I hadn't torn our family apart. "You should have talked to me," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "We could have figured it out. But you didn't give me that chance." She didn't respond. Just sat there, staring at her hands. The silence between us felt like a chasm, too wide to cross, too deep to fill. After a long pause, I spoke again. "I'm filing for divorce." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Mark, please, no," I cut her off. "It's over. I'll talk to a lawyer tomorrow. We'll figure out custody for Lucas, but I'm done." The finality of those words hit both of us hard. She nodded slowly, wiping at her tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but it was too late for apologies. The next day, I called a lawyer. It felt surreal, like I was signing the death certificate for my marriage. But there was also a strange sense of relief. Like I was finally taking control of a situation that had spiraled out of my hands. When I got back to the house, Lucas was waiting for me, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Dad, can we play catch?" he asked, holding up his glove. I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. "Of course, buddy." And in that moment, I realized something. No matter how messy things got, no matter how much Rachel had broken me, Lucas was my anchor, and for him, I'd keep moving forward. Filing for divorce wasn't as cathartic as I thought it would be. I imagined this moment where I'd feel a weight lift off my shoulders, like taking that step would somehow make everything easier. But instead, it felt like signing away a part of my life I wasn't ready to let go of. No matter how much I hated Rachel for what she did, the lawyer, Susan, was kind but blunt. She walked me through the paperwork, custody arrangements, and property division like it was just another day at the office. To her, it was routine. To me, it felt like ripping the seams off the life I'd spent a decade stitching together. "We'll prioritize shared custody unless there's a reason to contest it," Susan explained, sliding papers across the desk. "It's usually less disruptive for the child if both parents stay involved." I nodded, the words sinking in like lead. Shared custody. The idea of sharing Lucas with Rachel, knowing what she'd done, knowing she might still be seeing him, Mr. Carter, felt like swallowing glass. But this wasn't about me. It was about Lucas. When I got home, Rachel was in the kitchen, acting like it was any other day. She didn't ask about the lawyer. She didn't say much at all. We existed in this strange limbo, two people orbiting the same space but living in entirely different worlds. Later that evening, after Lucas had gone to bed, I found myself standing in the doorway of his room, watching him sleep. His small chest rose and fell with each breath, his favorite stuffed animal tucked under his arm. He looked so peaceful, so untouched by the chaos swirling around him, and that's when the guilt hit me. Not guilt for leaving Rachel, that decision felt more right with each passing day, but guilt for the fact that Lucas's world was about to change forever. He didn't ask for this. He didn't deserve it. But he was going to feel the impact of our choices, whether we liked it or not. The next morning, over breakfast, Rachel and I finally had the conversation. "We need to talk to Lucas," I said, my voice low. She nodded, her eyes avoiding mine. "I know." We sat down with him that evening, both of us trying to keep our emotions in check. Lucas looked between us, sensing the tension but not understanding it yet. "Buddy," I started, my heart pounding. "Mom and I need to tell you something important." His little face scrunched in confusion. "What is it?" Rachel took a deep breath. "Dad and we're not going to live together anymore. But we both love you very much, and that's never going to change." Lucas blinked, processing our words in that quiet way kids do when they're trying to understand something too big for them. "Are you getting divorced?" he asked softly. The question felt like a knife to the heart. I nodded. "Yeah, buddy. We are." For a moment, he was silent. Then his eyes welled up, and he whispered, "Is it because of me?" That broke me. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tight. "No, Lucas. This isn't your fault. Not even a little bit. Sometimes grown-ups have problems that they can't fix, but that doesn't mean we don't love you." Rachel echoed my words, her voice trembling, but all I could focus on was Lucas's small body shaking against mine as he cried. That night, after he finally fell asleep, I sat alone in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but my mind was loud, too loud. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about picking up the pieces and figuring out how to rebuild, not just for me, but for my son, because no matter how broken I felt, I had to be strong for him, and somehow, I would be. I spent the entire night thinking about how to talk to Lucas. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his parents aren't going to be together anymore without breaking his heart? How do you protect him from the mess Rachel made without lying to him? The next day, I sat him down in the living room. Rachel was there, but I did most of the talking. I didn't trust her to handle it without spinning it in her favor. "Hey, buddy," I started, my voice softer than I expected. "Mom and I need to talk to you about something important." Lucas's eyes darted between us, his little brow furrowing. Am I in trouble? That nearly broke me. No, not at all, I said quickly. But, things are going to be different around here. Mom and we've decided that we're not going to live together anymore. His face fell instantly. What? Why? Rachel jumped in then, her voice smooth like she'd practiced it. Sometimes grown-ups have problems they can't fix, sweetie. But we both love you very, very much. That's never going to change. Lucas's eyes filled with tears, and he shook his head. But, why can't you fix it? I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to tell him the truth, that his mom had betrayed us, that she'd made choices that couldn't be undone. But he didn't need that weight. Not now. It's complicated, buddy, I said gently. But it's not your fault. None of this is your fault. He didn't say anything after that. He just buried his face in my chest and cried. And all I could do was hold him, feeling like I'd failed him somehow, even though I knew this wasn't my doing. After he calmed down, I promised him we'd figure it out together. I told him I'd always be there for him, no matter what. And I meant it. That night, after Lucas went to bed, I sat alone in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. The anger, the betrayal, it was all still there. But now, there was something else. A sense of clarity. Rachel had broken us, but I wasn't going to let her break me, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let her break Lucas. In the weeks that followed, the house felt like a ticking time bomb. Every morning started with the same strained silence, like we were actors in a play neither of us wanted to be in. Rachel and I passed each other in the hallways like ghosts, communicating only when necessary, and even then, it was short, clipped, and filled with tension. Lucas, though, he was the glue holding things together, even if he didn't know it. His questions became less frequent, but I could see the confusion and sadness in his eyes. He missed how things used to be, and no matter how much I reassured him, I knew he felt the shift. Kids are smart. They feel the undercurrents even when we try to hide them. One Saturday morning, I decided to take Lucas out, just the two of us. We went to the park, the same one where I'd sat in my car the night I found out about Rachel's affair. It was strange how a place could hold such different emotions, pain and betrayal on one hand, and now, a moment of peace with my son on the other. We tossed a baseball back and forth, the rhythm of it oddly soothing. Lucas was quiet for a while, focused on catching the ball, but eventually, he spoke. Dad, he said, his voice hesitant. Do you and Mom hate each other? The question hit me harder than any fastball ever could. I caught the ball and knelt down in front of him, placing my hands on his small shoulders. No, buddy, I said softly. I don't hate your mom. We're better off living in different places. But we both love you. That's never going to change. He nodded slowly, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. He wasn't satisfied with the answer, but he didn't push. And I was grateful for that, because I didn't know how much more truth I could give him without breaking down myself. When we got home later that afternoon, Rachel was in the kitchen. She looked up when we walked in, her eyes lingering on me a little longer than usual. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the realization that I was pulling away in a way that was final. How was the park? She asked, her voice light, like she was trying to pretend we were still a normal family. Good, I replied shortly, ushering Lucas toward his room to drop off his stuff. As soon as he was out of earshot, Rachel spoke again. Mark, she began, her voice softer now, like she was testing the waters. I turned to face her, crossing my arms. What? She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. I didn't think it would get this bad. I didn't mean to hurt you. That made me laugh, actually laugh, but it wasn't out of humor. Didn't mean to hurt me? I repeated, shaking my head. Rachel, you had an affair with our son's teacher. You lied to me for months. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything we built. She flinched, but I didn't care anymore. The anger wasn't explosive now, it was cold, settled deep in my bones. I'm moving out next week, I added, cutting off whatever excuse she was about to throw at me. The papers are filed. You'll get them soon. For a moment, she just stared at me, like she was trying to find something, remorse, maybe, or a sliver of hope. But there was nothing left to find. You really think this is the best thing? She whispered that I nodded. It's the only thing. And with that, I walked away, not out of anger this time but because I was finally ready to start living without her. The day I moved out felt like the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't dramatic, no screaming matches or last-minute confessions. Just boxes. Boxes filled with clothes, books, and the remnants of a life that no longer fit. I packed quietly, methodically, like I was checking off a to-do list. Rachel hovered in the background, her presence heavy even when she didn't say a word. She offered to help once, but I shut that down with a quick shake of my head. Helping me pack up our broken marriage? No thanks. Lucas sat on the couch, his eyes following me as I carried box after box out the door. He didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. Every time I walked past him, I felt the weight of his unspoken questions pressing down on me. When the last box was loaded into the car, I knelt down in front of him. Hey, buddy, I said softly. I'm not going far. You'll still see me all the time, okay? This doesn't change how much I love you. He nodded, his lower lip trembling, but he didn't cry. That almost broke me more than if he had. Kids are resilient, but they shouldn't have to be. Rachel stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching us. I didn't look at her. I didn't have anything left to say. She'd made her choices. Now I was making mine. That I hugged Lucas one last time, then stood up and walked out the door without looking back. My new apartment was small, a one-bedroom on the second floor of a quiet building across town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No ghosts, no lies embedded in the walls. Just a blank slate. The first night alone was strange. The silence wasn't suffocating like I'd expected. It was freeing. I didn't have to wonder where Rachel was or who she was texting. I didn't have to pretend everything was fine. That I sat on the couch with a beer in one hand and my phone in the other, staring at a blank screen. I thought about texting Ethan, maybe asking him to come over, but I didn't. For the first time in months, I was okay sitting with myself. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and adjusting to the new routine. Lucas came over for the weekend, and we built IKEA furniture together, laughing when we realized we'd put the legs on backward. It wasn't the same as before, but it was good. Different, but good. One evening, after Lucas had gone back to Rachel's, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, it was all still there, but it didn't feel as heavy. It was like carrying a backpack you'd grown used to. You still felt the weight, but it didn't slow you down as much anymore. I grabbed my notebook, the same one I'd been scribbling in since this all started, and flipped to a fresh page. Sometimes the hardest part isn't letting go of the person who hurt you. It's realizing you're stronger without them. I closed the notebook, leaned back on the couch, and let out a long breath. That I wasn't fully healed. I didn't expect to be, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally moving forward, and that was enough. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again. Not the old kind of normal, the new kind. The kind where the weight of betrayal didn't sit heavy on my chest every morning, where Rachel's face wasn't the first thing I saw when I closed my eyes. Lucas adjusted better than I could have hoped. Kids have this way of adapting to change, finding comfort in routines, and we made new ones. Weekends became our time. We'd hit the park, play video games, build forts in the living room, and laugh in a way that reminded me what happiness felt like. Rachel and I managed to keep things civil, for Lucas's sake. The fiery resentment faded into something more distant, more muted. She was still Lucas's mom, and for that, I respected her role in his life. But as for us? That chapter was closed, sealed tight. One evening, after dropping Lucas off, I found myself back at the Rusty Anchor, the local bar Ethan had dragged me to a few times since the divorce. I wasn't there to drown my sorrows this time. I just wanted a drink, maybe some quiet. That's when I met Lena. She wasn't loud or flashy, just sitting at the bar, reading a dog-eared book and nursing a glass of red wine. There was something simple about her, something real. We started talking, nothing heavy, just easy conversation about favorite movies, bad dates, and the best pizza joints in the city. For the first time since everything with Rachel, I felt a spark. Not the kind that blinds you, but the kind that feels like a slow burn, steady and warm. We exchanged numbers, and I left the bar that night with a smile. Not because I was rushing into something new, but because I realized I could. My heart hadn't hardened completely. There was still room for new beginnings. Weeks turned into months, and Lena became a part of my life, not as a replacement for what I'd lost, but as a reminder of what I could still find. She met Lucas eventually, and seeing them together, the way she treated him with kindness and patience, solidified something in me. I wasn't broken anymore. I was rebuilding. One night, after putting Lucas to bed, I sat on my couch, that familiar notebook in hand. I flipped through the pages, reading the words of a man who'd been shattered, lost, angry. But I wasn't that man anymore. On the very last page, I wrote, "Some endings aren't failures. They're just the start of a better story." I closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf, and turned off the light, because the past was behind me and the future, it was finally mine.